Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Jerry Bowers, and I am the VP of External Affairs here at the MDI Biological Lab. We are thrilled to welcome everyone to our Science Cafe this evening. And for those of you who were brave enough to leave this gorgeous afternoon and join us in person, we are grateful. And I'm sure we'll have some folks who end up watching the recording. But we are very excited to welcome our partners at Landscape of Change to the Science Cafe stage this evening to give us an update on this wonderful project that I think began probably 24 years ago, 2020, I think, when we first came together. Raney Bench at the MDI Historical Society sort of gathered a group of folks to talk a little bit about how could we collaborate on a project that really drew attention to some of the impacts that we are seeing from our changing climate. And I think this year, perhaps more than most, I think we saw some examples of just how impactful this program can be in helping us all really take a look at the potential changes that will undoubtedly occur or that are occurring, I should say, as a result of climate change. So this evening, we're very, very pleased to welcome our friends back. We have Raney Bench with us, who is the Executive Director of the MDI Historical Society. And with her, we have Catherine Schmitt, who is this Science Communication Specialist at the Schoodic Institute. And also we have Jennifer Booher, who is an artist, who is a collaborator on this project. And so tonight I am going to just very quickly sort of turn things over to our panel, and they have put together a really nice presentation to update you on this most recent iteration of this project. For those of you that have been following along, you'll know that every year there's kind of some new and exciting approaches to this work, and I think it really speaks to the innovation and the careful thinking that Raney and Catherine and Jen and others have put into this project. So I'm just going to turn it right over to you, Raney, to get us started, because we're excited to hear what you all have been up to.
Thank you, Jerry, and thanks to everybody for being here this evening. As Jerry mentioned, we have been working together with this collaboration under the heading Landscape of Change since about 2020. And this is, I think we decided, our fourth Science Cafe on this topic. So we'll kind of start by giving a little bit of a background introduction to the project overall as a reminder for those who have seen it in the past, but also for anyone who's not familiar with the project, it'll give you a little bit of background information. And then we're going to dig into what phase of the project we're in working this year. So I'm going to share my screen to get us started. It's loading. There we go. So tonight we're going to talk specifically about an initiative that we've been working on together with Gulf of Maine Research Institute, the Oceanarium, the Maine Coast Heritage Trust, Schoodic Institute, Jennifer Booher, among other partners, called Coastlines, where we're looking at sea level rise and the impacts of severe storms and rising seas on MDI's coast. So as I mentioned, this is all part of a larger collaboration called Landscape of Change. And this group came together in 2020 to think about whether or not we could use historical resources at the MDI Historical Society and other organizations to understand the scope, scale, and speed of climate change and how it's impacting the different landscapes and seascapes on MDI. The first phase of this project was to look at some of the best documented historical resources in the collection of the MDI Historical Society and start to pull out and tease out different data and observations that were recorded in those records. So that first group of records was from a group called the Champlain Society, which were students that were studying, or actually not just here on the landscape of MDI between 1880 and 1890 and recording their observations, including of birds and climate, meteorological records. They did all sorts of plant studies and lots of different observations throughout that decade. And at the Historical Society's archive, we have their summer logbooks. And so being able to pull the information about, especially for the first year, the most well-recorded studies that were in our archive, which were related to birds, pollinators, sea water temperature, and climate. And then we were able to use different studies that were recorded sort of since the 1890s to be able to create different layers of information and data about those 4 different study areas, creating an interactive map that you can actually find through the MDI Historical Society's website or through Schmitt's website. And it shows you all the information from those historical observations up through modern observations. And so the really interesting thing about this Landscape of Change partnership is that we are using historical resources that are being combined with and compared to modern observations. So we can really get a longer data set and look at large timelines of change. So that first year, we, like I said, studied those 4 specific areas and created a final report where we were able to compare and contrast what the environment of MDI looked like in the 1880s, 1890s, through various points in time up to today. And then from that first year, we invited Jennifer Booher to come along and thinking about how we communicate the information from all of these different data points and from the sort of scientific or analytic side to really be able to talk about it within our community. And so the MDI Historical Society opened an exhibit on our Soamesville campus, and we invited Jennifer Booher to come along and think about how do we really evoke an emotional response to climate change in people? How do we communicate what's happening on the island, which is incredibly complex, in a more simple, approachable way for people who maybe aren't as interested in the science behind climate change, but are absolutely seeing changes within their own backyards or along the island and that they're concerned about. So Jennifer created 6 original artworks that depicted the complexity of climate change, which was a really great opportunity. We took them out on the landscape as banners and went around the island and talked to different people about the changes that they were seeing and the changes that Jen observed through the work of her art. And then we also exhibited it at Real Pizza, which was a really fun, totally kind of new way to reach different audiences. And then in the fall of 2022, we switched gears again and started to look at sea level rise through the study of king tides. And so this was work that lined up with things that Schmitt was already doing with a king tide study. And we were able to work with students and be able to think a little bit more about the impacts of king tides and what they said about sea level rise. And I'm going to turn it over to Catherine to introduce a little bit of what Schmitt's work was related to that project.
Thank you, Raney. Thanks everybody for joining us this evening. We have been working with a project funded by the National Park Service since 2019 that was related to some research on nor'easters and their impacts on Acadia National Park, as well as Cape Cod and Boston Harbor Islands. And with that project, we started monitoring sea level rise by documenting king tides. So king tides are the highest tides of the year. The height of the tide varies throughout the month. And so there's a monthly high tide, a monthly low tide. And then during certain times of the year, the tides are even higher. So the monthly high tide is even higher. And by looking at those tides, we can get a sense for what futures. The idea is that by taking photos and watching the height of these exceptionally high tides, you can get a sense for what the average high tide of the future looks like. So we initiated this monitoring, and in partnership, the next slide, Raney. We, with our research partners who are based at the University of Rhode Island, we were able to access some of the latest data and projections on sea level rise, which were put out by multiple federal agencies in 2022. And so this chart is just showing the projected rise in sea level above 2020 levels, with varying levels of certainty regarding human actions to slow global warming emissions. So from 2030, 2040, 2050. And the next slide is going to show how king tides, by being a foot or more higher than the average high tide, can really give us a peek into the future. And so that's the idea behind the monitoring. And the Mount Desert Island Biological Laboratory supports a wonderful citizen science platform called Anecdata that already had, so this king tide monitoring happens actually all around the world. And so there already was a pre-existing project where people were documenting king tides. So we just started contributing to that project and adding observations of king tides dating back to 2019. But if you explore the site and it's publicly accessible, you can find even older observations. So it was really easy for us then to start working with students and other partners and expand the engagement on sea level rise. And that sort of led nicely into the project with Mount Desert Island High School.
So in the fall of 2022, we were able to get a grant from Villanova University that actually was specifically designed to support history and museum organizations in conversations related to climate change. And we decided that we would be able to, or we wanted to work with Ruth Poland's high school advanced environmental studies class. And it just so happened that during the hour and a half of their class was also the time of the king tides. So we were able to go into the classroom and use historical resources from the collection of the MDI Historical Society that showed different storm events that have affected the island over time. So what areas of vulnerability have storms impacted in the past? That can be a really good way of thinking about where those impacts will continue in the future, what infrastructure is affected by those storms. We have oral histories from lighthouse keepers out on Mount Desert Rock related to hurricanes. We have photographic evidence of severe storms, newspaper accounts, diaries, journals, all sorts of things that we can know about the past. Including things that are related to infrastructure. We have access to the records of the very first bridge that was built as a private toll bridge to the island. And that was built at a maximum height of 14 feet, that they did not anticipate the seas would ever be more than 14 feet, which is fascinating to think, you know, in 1832. And then as Catherine digs into some of the sea level heights that we're seeing now, to see what a dramatic change that is. So in taking these records to students, we were able to have them start thinking about the island from a really long perspective, not just what they're thinking about or seeing in their day-to-day lives, or even just thinking about what's being predicted for the future, but how have islanders been dealing with these issues for a long period of time. We were presenting to them in the classroom. So you can see on the right, Jennifer is presenting some of her We Change with Them artistic representations of climate change. And then on the left, Catherine is presenting predictions of sea level rise. And then we also took them to visit the Dorr Museum at College of the Atlantic to learn how you communicate information to the public. So we have all of this really complicated and complex information, but you want to distill it down to sort of its most pure or easiest to engage with people form. And museums are particularly good at that. And so being able to bring students into that experience was really great. So they wanted very badly to be able to create a final project that communicated to the sort of general public, but specifically their communities, what they felt about this, about sea level rise and their concerns about sea level rise. And as I said, we went out to see the king tides. And so that was really impactful for them. We have these amazing videos and recordings of the students sort of responding in real time to seeing the high level tide. And then in December 2022, over their Christmas break, we had one of our big storms, the first of the series of big storms that have been coming through, where it came in on a king tide, and we had this really significant storm surge. We took the students out to the oceanarium where they had a chance to see the site. And then after the storm, we were able to show them pictures of the oceanarium inundated with seawater, and other locations like down in Manset or in Tremont where they were observing the king tide. We did compare and contrast photos for them after the Christmas break. And it was amazing to see that even sort of more created a sense of urgency among the students to share out their concerns and their feelings. But unfortunately, the semester ended before they were able to finish a final product. And that is the last report that we gave at Science Cafe. Was we've done this really amazing work with these students, and they were fired up and inspired to do something in the community, but they didn't have time to finish it. And so we took that banner or that baton and decided to carry it forward. And so Jen, this is where she can pipe in to talk a little bit about what her inspiration was for that.
Hi. So about a year ago, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. About a year ago, Raney and Catherine and I started talking about sea level rise on MDI and what we could do in the way of starting conversations. And it seemed to me that one of the main problems in starting a public conversation was like the relative invisibility of the problem. Like until this past January, like sea level rise just didn't impact people in their daily lives. And it was really not invisible, but most people weren't aware of it except during really high tides or big storms in very well trafficked and low-lying areas like Hulls Cove or Seawall. And since it's really hard to talk about things you can't see, I figured that my part of this conversation could be making things visible. Next slide. So I proposed that we start marking the high point of tidal flooding around the island and of predicted future sea level, and make a simple and recognizable symbol that people would start to associate with the conversation. And I started with the skyline of MDI. Next slide. And created a logo for the signs and for the project. Next slide. I made a stencil from the logo. And next slide. And Raney and Catherine did a test installation at the oceanarium using the flood level from the 2020 storm and predictions of what average high tide and what the tide would be in the future if a storm like 2022 happened, say, in 2050. Next slide. The slide on the left shows one of the high points of the 2020 flood at the oceanarium, and on the right shows a prediction for 2050. The oceanarium staff had marked the 2022 flood levels. Next slide. More signs were installed around the oceanarium property in early summer in locations that were really visible, prominent for tourists and visitors. Next slide. Then we partnered with Maine Coast Heritage Trust to do an installation at the Kelly Farm in Bernard. Next slide. Volunteers painted and installed the signs with Catherine's guidance. Next slide. Marking predicted sea level in 2100 and in 2050. It's a little hard to see on the slide on the right, but the sign farther back is the 2050 prediction. Thank you. All right, next slide. And I think it's Catherine's turn.
So all of this, we did have the 2022 storm, which was marked, but we're still sort of thinking about the future. And all of this was, as Jen said, to help people visualize sea level rise. And then January 2024 happened. And it's sort of the storms which were essentially the 21, what we had been using for 2,100 sea levels, is what we experienced in January. So a 3-foot storm surge, on top of a higher sea level. And so it just kind of put all of this work in a different light and a different context. And it added, I think, greater relevance to all the king tide monitoring that we were doing, which all of a sudden has provided baseline data, and before photos that now we can measure change against. And even though that wasn't necessarily the intent and sort of purpose, they've taken on this new meaning, and we are going to continue monitoring. I at first, I was, after the storms, I was like, should we even keep monitoring sea level rise, because the thing that we were trying to picture has just happened and now we've experienced it. But talking to people feel like it is worthwhile and we should keep doing it and do more of it, because it's providing these reference points. And so we're going to continue to look at high water levels, and we are still documenting damage throughout Acadia and the island, and looking at the lasting impacts of the storm.
So this is just to kind of show on what Catherine's point about the accuracy of the signs that we had been installing. So there's the sign for the 2022 storm level at the Oceanarium. And then this is one of the January storms. And this clearly was not at the height of tide, because in December 2022, the Oceanarium experienced 12 inches. So that 2022 sign is 12 inches up. But in this January, the 2 January storms, and in March, they had over 24 inches in the barn. So it actually doubled this location. And we need to get back out onto the landscape. And as Catherine said, continue to mark the first of all, just to document and make sure that it's being documented and that it stays present in people's minds, but also to be able to then have these benchmarks for which we can understand change over time, because sea level rise is accelerating. And so being able to have, well, there's no benchmark when something's accelerating, but have something where we know kind of where we were on the landscape, and what the landscape looked like at the time. So when we, as Jen mentioned, we did two versions of the installations at the Oceanarium, and then another one at the Kelly Farm. The Oceanarium installations, you can go out and see, there's the marks on the building in white show the storm level, and if we had that storm in 2050 or 2100, what those heights would be. But these blue stencils are out along the marsh walk, and we've installed those to show what the height of sea level would be, in this case in 2050. And that's Route 3 there in the distance. And then here's me and my dad installing the 2051, just for a sense of scale. And on the right, and then on the left, this was during the January storms, the red arrow is pointing to the sign, which is completely submerged. So the intent was that the sign showed at the bottom of the stencil what the 2050 average high tide would be. And during the January storm, as Catherine said, it was more of a level of what the 2100 predictions would be, which had this sign completely inundated. Do you want to talk about any of these, Jen?
I think you and I have the same things to say, so if you'd like to continue.
Sure. So we did the additional installation at the Kelly Farm, partnering with Maine Coast Heritage Trust, to try and show again that same concern for what is going to change on the landscape as a result of sea level rise. So we worked with the community, as Jen showed those great pictures of people helping us to compile the signs. And then we actually we use this as an opportunity to test a do-it-yourself kit that we're measuring based on the high tide during the point of installation to what the predicted high tide would be, taking into account variations of height in the landscape. And so 2100 on the left shows the day of installation, and 2100 on the right shows a king tide. So the point of the 2100 height. It was not that it would reach the stencil, thankfully, but that it would get to the footings where the sign was placed in. So that water prediction was accurate, was good to see, although even still a little bit higher than we anticipated. And then we also had documentation from the storms. So this is the same sign during the January storm. And you can see the inundation of the site here during these storms. And the same here. So this is further along on the Kelly Farm Preserve, where you can see Jen showed the slide on the left earlier with the 2050 sign in the background and the 2100 sign forward. And this is after the storms. That 2050 sign was completely submerged. Do you want to add anything, Jen?
Yeah, that's seaweed hanging on the sign. Left behind when the tide receded.
Yeah. So these marks on the landscape were one way that we wanted to be able to talk to people or communicate to people, even if we weren't there, about risks and changes and things that we should be anticipating and thinking about. But we also did a number of other community outreach programs.
One of which was, again, drawing upon history of this historical map from the 1890s of Mount Desert Island, which the map itself engages people. And then we asked them to put stickers on places where they thought might be vulnerable to sea level rise and flooding. And so that became this great conversation starter. And this photo is some Schoodic Institute early career professionals who were at a table at Family Science Night at Mount Desert Island Biological Laboratory last July. And we did this at a couple other events. And it turned into just a really great way to have conversations with people about the flooding that they had been experiencing. Or were
The
working on.
MDI, yeah, and the MDI Historical Society is archiving the maps. So when we do an event and we bring a map and we invite people to place stickers on it, we indicate the location and the date for the event. And then we're going to be able to develop our own archive of these maps of community response that show people's acute concerns. And it will be nice to see before the storms and after the storms, the changes for where people are marking the landscape of areas of concern, because I know that there were places that surprised people that that we weren't expecting inundation to the degree that they were. But we're also trying to really listen and document. So in addition to communicating, we want to hear more and more from people. And we know that people are eager to talk. The Historical Society and Schoodic both put out calls for people to share photos, stories, images, whatever the artifacts with us related to the storms so that we can build this archive in the future. But we also wanted to just get people in the room talking to each other. And so we partnered with the Gulf of Maine Research Institute to host a dinner called community supper called Fishtails, where specifically we were inviting people who lived and worked along the waterfront in Tremont and Southwest Harbor to come in for a community supper. It was not recorded or moderated in any way. We just wanted people to sit down together and share a meal and talk about what they've seen, share memories, what are their concerns, what do they think about as we sort of talk about building back the different areas that were damaged, or we think about how we change or improve infrastructure. We had a rolling slideshow of about 120 slides that showed damaged by the storms over this winter, but also had historic images of people and waterfronts and ships and boat builders and all sorts of different things that really did engage people. They were really looking at the slides and talking to each other and sharing memories. Jennifer's artwork was there on display, and it was a new opportunity for those communities to see the artwork that she created with the banners, the original artwork. And then people brought their own photos in and shared their photos with each other and with us. We left that evening having built a stronger sense of community and trust. We had a specific request from many people there that they wanted more of these events that were unmoderated, just a chance to have people sit in a room together and talk and share and just sort of leave feeling closer connected and more aligned in what their hopes and concerns are. And then we also had a number of people ask to be recorded. They wanted to present their story and have it shared in perpetuity with the Historical Society and record that oral history. So that's a project we'd like to move on to in the future. And so there's a lot of like what we're doing, but we also have plans for our own project's future. And so one of the things that I found really interesting is this partnership and the collaboration that we've been doing with Landscape of Change has gained national attention, which is really amazing. It has won a National Leadership in History Award. It has been published in 2 different books. It's been the feature of of blogs and radio shows. It really is a model for how to work collaboratively. But what I learned when I was being interviewed about the project from the people who were drawn to it is that it also is meeting the standards of best practices for climate engagement that were just recently put out by NOAA. And so in sort of being asked about how we were aligning our goals with these standards of best practices, I was like, I didn't know we were doing that. And Catherine and Jen didn't either. We were just acting from a local perspective, like what motivates us? What are we concerned about? What are we hearing from our community? What are we seeing on the landscape? How do we get as many people to get involved as possible? Because ultimately, the goal of this collaboration is to have a common understanding of how climate change is affecting MDI, because we're not going to be able to respond as individual towns. We have to be able to respond as an island. And so the more that this project can help create engagement and understanding, then I think the more powerful that opportunity becomes. So the different ways that we were engaging with youth, talking to the general public, making climate change relevant within our own ecosystems and our own spaces and our own backyards. Those are all some of like the best ways for engaging people with climate change conversations in the future.
One of the ways we'd like to do that is to develop the Coastlines Project as a unit that we can take into local schools. And we have just received a grant from the Gulf of Maine Research Institute to work on that. And it's within their Learning Ecosystems Northeast program. And I've been a member for probably 2 years. And before that, I had never heard of a learning ecosystem. But the idea is to build relationships between all of the different people and institutions where kids learn within a local area. So the learning ecosystem for Hancock County includes math teachers, science teachers, librarians, 4-H teachers or leaders, a couple of education coordinators with local land trusts. There's an aquaculturist with Maine Sea Grant, and there's me. Tanya Prentice, the science teacher at the Tremont School, is a member, and we are doing installations next week with her 7th and 8th grade classes as a first step in curriculum development. Ruth Poland, the environmental science teacher at MDI High School, will also be working with us on developing this. My personal goal is that this becomes a regular part of the school year curriculum within the MDI school system. And I think back to you, Catherine.
Another way that we're sort of taking this collaboration in different directions and using a lot of the anecdata information and all of those photos that Raney said people were so generous in sharing with us is using them to validate this research. So the researchers that I'm working with are at University of Rhode Island. Some of them, you know, they've maybe been to Acadia once on a site visit, and so they're not as familiar with the landscape as we are. And so when they create figures like this, we can help to validate them and help show them on the landscape. So the storm tides in January were 3 feet higher than average. So that's looking at what was projected, say, for 2080, 2090, 2100. And those researchers take these sea levels and they project them onto these 3-dimensional visualizations, which there's one in the next slide, of Tremont School on the left. Bass Harbor Marsh is off to the north on the top of the slide. And this visualization is essentially showing what 3 feet of sea level rise would look like. So whether this is the storm tide or whether this is future sea level, can be interpreted either way. But if we want to talk about the storm, we can use people's photos and people's experiences from those storms, the types of things we're documenting through this project, to validate these models and make sure that the scientific data are accurate. And so that's one of the things that we'll be working with over the coming year. Here are just an example of some of the images from the slides that can be used to validate the maps and the graphics of projected flooding. And this process, so it's not just that the researchers do it and then they go away, but those maps and visualizations actually come back to the community. So I had a big printout of those maps at the Fishtails community supper. And again, people love maps, and people, came over, and it was a chance to have a conversation about the flood. And so it is sort of an iterative process of using actual community experience to inform the scientific information.
So in the past, we've been really focused on landscape of change and the different sort of year focuses that we have in both documenting climate change, but also in that public engagement and communication. But I think that we've been hearing, certainly from community members, that there's a more urgent and pressing need for concrete action, and a feeling like people are doing something meaningful and can contribute in meaningful ways. So those last couple slides are going to be just a little bit about how you can get involved and how you can be participating in this work before we open it up to questions and comments. Catherine.
So this is a slide of our field trip out to monitor king tides with Mount Desert Island High School. And that was at Seawall, and that is what Seawall looks like today. And so I think, the call to action is still to pay attention and still to contribute, to pay attention to where the water level is and what other changes are happening around you. Because if we hadn't been doing that before the storms, I don't think we would really, the magnitude is there, but having a sense for really having paid close attention to the landscape before really gives us a sense for what has been lost and what has been impacted. So paying attention and continuing to pay attention is going to be important. And one of the things that we're thinking about, because it's what we heard from people in conversations after the storms, is really about transportation and about these road networks and about the distances that people are traveling from where they live to where they work, and how the island fits into those travel distances, and how flooding, whether it's regular rain and intense precipitation that is flooding roadways more frequent, or whether it's sort of sunny day king tide flooding that now makes roads impassable, and looking at our transportation networks, which is also something that needs to be looked at when we think about emissions and reducing greenhouse gas emissions for the atmosphere. Another thing that's really helped, I think for me, is just the importance of this history. And I kind of had a realization sort of at the community supper and post-storm that the historical society is not just like, history isn't just the past, right? But history, we're making, like, today is tomorrow's history. And so this idea of a historical society documenting and saving the maps of where people marked up and recording people's stories, that is our role in this project as well. And so we think about historical work from the past, like an article that I wrote about the Tay shipwreck on Sand Beach, as being a nice piece of history. But fast forward 10 years and the shipwreck is exposed, and everybody's looking for information, and what story are they sharing but that story from the historical society from the past. And so history really does matter, and it's relevant today and for the future.
Love that Catherine said the history mattered part, not me. And other ways to get involved. So one thing that it's very hard to think about maybe pausing and slowing down in the face of an emergency, especially in light of how you need to build back after an emergency. So we have the shore path here on the right and seawall on the left. And it's tempting to just say, we got to get this stuff built back as fast as possible. And We know that that's happening along the wharfs and the waterfront as well. But what we miss is the opportunity to be thoughtful about knowing that this is not an anomaly, that this is going to happen again. And we know we have projections where the state has already said by 2050, towns and municipalities need to take into account this level of sea rise. By 2100, it needs to be this level of sea rise. And those numbers will change, probably increase, over time. And so if we don't slow down and really be thoughtful about how we build back with those different measures taking those into account, first of all, we're just wasting money and resources, but we're missing the opportunity to improve the infrastructure in our communities. And so I think that that while it's difficult as a community, we should be engaging our towns and in conversations, asking, what are you doing in the build back that takes into account where these projections are taking us in the future? And as I mentioned, my goal ultimately out of the Landscape of Change partnership is to create one common set of sort of understandings of what climate change looks like on MDI in the future. Because while obviously each municipality on the island is its own government and makes its own decisions for its town, the fact is we're still only 108 square miles and nature doesn't care. And so if we can't come to some sort of consensus where we're all working together, we're just pushing the problems to our neighbors. And so there's the League of Towns, even though every town has their own town manager, that there's a League of Towns where they all meet together. And I think that there's probably increased opportunity for more conversation to take place at those League of Town meetings. They are open to the public. We could be more, we could be advocating a little more, or at least in there asking questions and being thoughtful about how communities are coming together to address the problems rather than thinking sort of just in front of their own immediacy, I guess. And then we want to do more documenting of oral histories. We want to do more documenting of images, and then continue to have community conversations and community suppers. We hosted the one in Southwest, but in the fall we were planning another one for Otter Creek, and trying to move around the island to be able to engage with people in different places on the island.
This is the Somesville Dam fish ladder, where a community member used the stencil to mark the 2022 storm line right there by the mill pond. So if you have an idea for an installation, if you'd like to mark the tide levels from, say, the January storms, the stencils are available to borrow from the MDI Historical Society. And if you're interested in having us coordinate an installation of the Coastlines project, like you've seen at the Kelly Farm, you can contact one of us.
So, oops, stop screen sharing. So that is the formal part of the presentation. We wanted to give adequate time for questions and comments and answers, if we have them, or to engage in conversation among of those of you who might have answers to questions that we don't, or thoughts that you would like to contribute. So please, you can put them in the chat, or if you also would like to, I think Jerry, you said raise your hand and pipe up. Jerry will help us moderate that.
Absolutely. There's a lot to unpack here, so I'm certain that many of you will have a lot of questions. I know I have a bunch, but if you want to use the raise hand feature there at the bottom of the screen, if you're on a computer, or up at the top if you're on a mobile device, that'll bring you to the top of our guest list here, and we'll be able to call on you and have you ask your question. While folks are thinking about their questions, Raney, you mentioned the importance of really interacting and engaging with municipal officials. I think the idea of the League of Towns is a great one. I'm just wondering, is there any sort of formal outreach from this group to have a presentation or to engage specifically in conversations with decision makers, lawmakers, and decision makers?
So A Climate to Thrive is one of the long-term partners for Landscape of Change, and they have a stronger advocacy role among all of the sort of permanent partners for this project. So they are doing and working with Gulf of Maine Research Institute climate planning for the town of Tremont and for the town of Mount Desert. And then Southwest Harbor is looking at and has been talking to A Climate to Thrive to help with that as well. And Bar Harbor's working on its own. So A Climate to Thrive uses the information and the data that is gathered through the work that we're doing that we just presented, and then they're able to sort of translate that into their planning documents and into their conversations with town leaders. But we have not actually extended it sort of into that next step to get into municipal meetings to present this information just from an information standpoint.
Yeah, great. Judy, did you have a question?
Yes, thank you. This is fascinating and wonderful to hear that of all the things that you're doing, and I'm very excited by it. I live in Salisbury Cove, and I have a lot of friends who live all over the island. And anecdotally, I've heard people have been impacted by in their homes who have southwest or southeastern exposures to the land, because you know that everything undulates around. And I was curious about that because in my instance, my home is on Frenchman's Bay and it faces to the west. And what I experienced was not so much a sea rise, but that the wind was carrying, which is the prevailing winds are the westerlies. And these were southern winds that took the water and pushed it across the bay, so that in fact it cleaned up my beach. And usually I have all this seaweed just is up to my eyeballs, and these January storms just had this wonderful, unfortunate happening of having it clean the beach of all of what would usually blow in. And I wonder, in the maps that you have, I would love to see how that looks, and is that an accurate concept, or am I know it's anecdotal, so I just wonder about that.
Well, you experienced it. So certainly, so the storms were different and the winds were out of a different direction. So the typical storms, the ones that I had started working on, which were the big concern, the most damaging, were nor'easters, where the wind is coming out of the northeast. And so the storms that we had December and January and March had these southerly winds, which is not typical for Maine in the winter. And we're still kind of waiting for the analysis on, is that something to be expected in the future? They were more like hurricane winds and not nor'easter winds. And so they may have cleaned off your beach, but whatever was on your beach ended up on somebody else's beach. So
I'm aware.
yeah. So
But
I mean, we still don't know if that's what we should be expecting. I mean, the coastline of Mount Desert Island is sort of had evolved with these northeasterly winter winds, and so the impacts that the wind shift are significant. And so we just we don't have sort of data on what that means or where it came from or what's the future.
Well, I had never seen winds that carried the water. You just saw the water being pushed, and the waves were going away from my property across to Lemoyne. And it was very striking to me. And I know that my benefit was somebody else's, catastrophe.
Yeah.
But I just wonder about how that looks, and so I guess the data is still to be determined.
We did and storm surge is always slightly unpredictable because it's a combination of wind, right? Of wind and tide at the height. And so it's always sort of a unique combination that's leading to storm surge. And I think, there were a lot of places that flooded in January that did not normally flood. But Jerry, do you want me to answer the questions in the chat that are about sort of the same?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
So is the January storm an outlier or an indicator that 2050 should be accelerated? We don't know. you know, what we do know is that the sea level is rising, it's rising faster. And we do know that so the forecasts that we were using were that middle uncertainty range. So we were using a foot higher than today by 2050 and 3 feet by 2100, which was aligned with the state of Maine's original Maine Climate Council projections. Now, the Maine Climate Council will be coming out with some updated numbers, I think, later this year. And so we may have to adjust. But one of the things that I've learned is it's a constantly moving. As Raney said, there really is no baseline anymore because the baseline just keeps shifting. And so you just kind of always have to keep shifting. So probably, yes, we do need to accelerate or think differently about 2050. And then the question about with the Acadia National Park to mark sea level. So working with the park is a little bit different because of that, the permanent installation. But we have certainly talked with them about doing a temporary installation, or there's also some programs where you set a post where people can go and just take a photo from an established location, and then it uploads it and you can see sort of a time lapse of those images. It's called a chronologue. So we are in conversation with the park about some documenting levels there.
And I would add that we also had an opportunity for the first time to go into the interpretive training sessions for the rangers, or I had that opportunity last 2 weeks ago, and I'll be back in a couple weeks as they bring in new classes of interpretation staff for the season. And in that, I presented the findings from Landscape of Change, but also talking to the rangers about their comfort level engaging with the general public related to climate change. And so giving information, like there was a study just recently that I found interesting that we have a perception problem about climate change in this country. So we perceive that there are a lot of people who deny that climate change is human caused or that it's a pressing issue. But the actuality is that the vast majority of Americans understand that climate change is real and human caused, like over 75%. But we think it's only actually like 30% of people believe that climate change, understand that climate change is real and human caused. So we have this perception gap. And so just empowering you and the rangers and whomever else to feel more confident to be able to talk to someone about this and not be scared that you're going to get shut down or be, accused of political whatevers. Just is helpful, and then giving the information in a way that is clear to communicate and easy to talk about to people who clearly are engaged with the landscape of Acadia and Mount Desert Island. So we've encouraged them to look at the first year report of our maps that are available through the Landscape of Change collaborative website, to Jennifer's artwork, that are lots of different resources that rangers can use as they're talking to visitors throughout the summer season.
So there is one more question in the chat, and I'll throw it out there. I'm not sure, maybe this is a Catherine question, I'm not sure, but just talking about the familiarity with a 100-year floodplain map and the corresponding, process for receiving and applying for and receiving building permits. But just the question is there anything similar for predicted 100-year coastal storm penetration and damage? I wonder if those two things are aligned.
I see that question. I don't know the answer. Hello, Ellen. Nice to have you joining us. I don't, at least not in terms of floodplain. So there's a lot of mapping happening. There's a lot of forecasting happening. There's a lot of different sea level rise viewers and interactivity. And there isn't anything similar, at least in terms of permitting. So, at least in terms of looking at storm levels and things and how it relates to development or shoreline stabilization, not that I'm aware of. But I do know that with that 2022 interagency report, at least the federal agencies are now they all are on the same page, and there is like the one go-to place for information on rates of sea level rise and projections and sort of the latest uncertainties. which is nice now to have that single place, because prior to that, they were all putting out their different ones. And so having them all together is good. And then whenever you have a state level one, it's always then you check the state. And we have also some really good projections coming out of the main geological survey. And so those two sources are the ones that I would use, unless you're working with specific researchers focused on a local location, like our work with University of Rhode Island.
Yeah.
So if there's a specific place that you're interested in, I'm happy to have a follow-up conversation.
That's
I
great.
think we could also add that I think the first institutions that are going to act on this are the insurance companies. They're already starting to make their own decisions about what they consider like a flood zone.
Mhm. I'm just curious, your work with the high school, is there an ongoing project there? I mean, it does strike me that this is a wonderful opportunity for, a number of things, but one is engaging with decision makers and lawmakers, and just wondering if there's any thought around how to empower students to sort of be that voice.
Jen's been in more recent touch with educators through the grant that she just got. So I don't know, Jen, if you want to answer any of that.
I think that's one of the things that we're going to be engaging with as we develop the curriculum for the coastlines. We need to do a lot of talking to different people within the school system before I can really say anything definite about that.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, we definitely want to work within the school system.
Yeah, Judy.
There's only one way on and off this island by car. And I'm wondering what the projections are for that causeway and that bridge or whatever we call it. And, it could really be pretty dire.
Yes, we know that's a vulnerable location.
Well,
And
people-
that is one of the places that we're tracking as these storms happen. Is it flooded or not? And it was briefly, I think, during these recent storms, and certainly it is also a focus for the researchers that we're working with. And if we think about 3 feet higher sea level, or we think about 2080, 2090, 2100, the road will need to be higher.
Mhm. And because all those poles, I mean, that's the way electricity comes into this island as well. And I don't know what the structures are like, but I know that wasn't in recent memory, the poles were looking like this at one point after a storm. So
We did ask, because we heard, James, sorry, just 1 minute. We heard and saw on social media during the storms about inundation at the head of the island. And I've put out a call for photos, and we have not received any. So if anyone knows of any pictures of the head of the island while the road was inundated, and it was brief, I think it was closed for like 20 minutes, at least one of the storms, we would love to have those pictures, please. Sorry, James, I kind of cut in on your question.
thank you.
Not at all. Thank you for what you're doing here for this subject. Apropos to Judy's comment, though, not only is the bridge vulnerable for everybody on the island, but the roads themselves, Hulls Cove particularly, and also, as you showed in those dramatic pictures down in the lower coast and the marine land. So what kind of planning is going on to provide guidance and transportation for people coming back and forth to work on the island itself?
Catherine mentioned our need to, and our desire with this group to look at that as a next project. As we kind of every year shift our focus. We were thinking about, what is the transportation piece look like? What happens in different communities that get cut off from being able to access work or home or emergency services or the grocery store? How long does it take to move from one place to another? I think that would be information that would be necessary for town planners and for emergency services. And I don't know, we don't seem to know of anybody else doing it when the three of us talked about it. but we could, if they were, we would be happy to partner with or bring this. The strength of landscape of change in general is the fluidity of the partners that come into this project as we overlap with the various missions of different organizations. And so we have these opportunities to bring in other organizations to work with us as we phase into different ways of looking at climate change.
What about the towns themselves? I mean, shouldn't this be first on agenda?
Yeah, and like I said, I think A Climate to Thrive has been, well, I know they've been on the lead of at least with Tremont, has been especially active in this conversation because they saw acutely that they're going to be an archipelago, you know, in any of these flooding events, totally cut off. And so that's the community I know to be the most active from the town management side of it.
Yeah, I think
Ken, I
anybody,
don't want to put you on the spot,
Wanna
but
be-
Ken Colburn's here and he might actually have an answer for you, James, if I can put Ken on the spot. He's
Sorry, Rainey, give me the question again.
about the community responses on MDI to planning for infrastructure and transportation and how they're working to think about improving those infrastructures.
Yeah, I don't have a concrete answer for you. I know, being a member of the Maine Climate Council, there's a transportation working group that's pretty focused on that kind of issue, albeit generally for across the state. So that involves a lot of lowlands and culverts and bridges, not just the coast. And then, of course, Climate to Thrive is also working with, I think, all of the towns, maybe only 3 of the towns on MDI, in several respects of climate change, one of which is the transportation and vulnerability risks.
are there federal
associated
funds
with
available
access.
for the repairs or at
Pardon
all?
me?
Are there federal funds available at all for some of this?
Federal funds are funding some of the analytical work behind the Maine Climate Council and the Governor's Office of Policy Innovation of the Future, which is sort of the actual government entity on this. And a lot of money has come in with respect to those issues and the Governor's Energy Office issues. I don't know directly, other than assessments, though, with respect to access risks like those you described. It should be, but at this point, most areas are actually quite behind the discussion featured in this Zoom webinar. So there hasn't been a whole lot of spending yet on actual solving the problem rather than just getting your arms around it.
I
Great
see.
Ken, sorry to put you on the spot.
Not at all, not at all.
I see several more science cafes in our future, I think, around this topic. A lot of great conversation that needs to be had. So it would be great to convene some of those folks and maybe ask them if they could share what they know about what the plans are. So we will reach out and schedule that for sure. Ken, I'm looking at you. So
Well, and I'm sure leadership of the council would also welcome that opportunity, as would leadership of Climate to Thrive. Thanks,
Great,
Jerry.
we'd love to do that. So thank you all so much. We ran a little over time, but as you can see, there's a lot of really important information here. And I just want to close by thanking Rainey and Catherine and Jennifer for being here with us, for really having the vision for this project from the outset. And you know, Rainey, I think you've all made believers of us in terms of talking about the fact that we're making history today. And so this is really an important component of who we are as a community, and being able to come together and have these conversations is wonderful. So thank you for the good work that you're doing. And thank you for keeping us informed. One closing question though, if folks want to stay abreast of what the next projects are, how should they sign up? What's the best way to continue to get information about this project and maybe, you know, more community conversations that you might be having?
So the MDI Historical Society has weekly e-blasts or e-communication that will tell you about events and projects. And then we have 3 newsletters that we produce a year that give more detailed information about projects and collaborations. So that's where the most active and ongoing information can be found. And then also on our website, we have the Landscape of Change banner, which has the things that we've been doing in the past there, including Jen's artwork.
Wonderful.
Kath,
Thank you
I think
all.
Catherine probably Skudik has communications too. Sorry.
Yeah, so signing up for our monthly e-newsletter is the best place to find out what's happening. And then we can share a link after this with the just the main place, you know, on our website, all the storm tide stories. You can find them all collected in one location.
Wonderful. That's great. Thank you all again for joining us. We will be back in 2 weeks with our Science Cafe talking about kidney regeneration. Not quite as scintillating as this conversation, but we're excited about it. So we hope you join us and learn a bit more about some of the science that's happening here at the MDI Biolab. So thank you all so much for being with us this evening.
Thank you.
Everybody, thanks, Jerry.